My first reaction is, what? It doesn't have any connection to that at all.
The motif itself goes centuries back, right, to the Song Dynasty when it was used everywhere.
I would call it a more assured sense of national identity.
It's a classic case of winning the battle, losing the war here.
There was a visible reputational damage to the brand.
It just means that their admiration is more conditional. So brands are being judged not just on innovation, value and services, but also on the cultural behavior and how they use their power in the market.
Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tuyuan, joining me for a chat on French luxury brand Louis Vuitton's trademark dispute with Chinese milk tea chain Mali Tea. Jia Yuxuan, a research assistant at the Center for China and Globalization. Subramania Bhatt, the founder and CEO of the Singapore-based marketing technology company China Trading Desk, and Gong, professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics here in China. Welcome to the show, everybody. So, to begin with, John, could you briefly walk us through what happened between Louis Vuitton and Mali Tea, the Chinese tea chain?
Well, it's an interesting case. I think in the trademark, this tea company uses one small little pattern in the overall, trademark, the patent, and and it was sued for that. I think it's a this is a very legally intricate matter. I'm really not an expert in that. I think, even a lawyer is probably difficult to make a judgment. I think it's going to be leaving to the court to decide whether this is indeed an infringement of the trademark. It's an interesting case. That's my current understanding of this.
But as an average consumer, does the four-petal trademark of Mali Tea, when you see it, does it remind you of anything related to Louis Vuitton?
Well, I don't represent all the consumers, but at least
Right.
from my perspective, when I first read about this case, my first reaction is, what? It doesn't have any connection to that at all. So I'm actually, at least as far as I'm concerned, I'm not convinced that I have any connection in thinking about these two brands. At the first glance, it's really, I mean, you can't even see this little pattern in a tea trademark, right? And that doesn't remind me, it doesn't have any connection in my mind at all.
And then to
Sorry, but
you
I
should go
want to
ahead.
add, according to actually available reporting, when the court was making this judgment, it also considered Mali Tea's previous trademark applications. Since, I think, 2022, the company has applied for 17 trademarks containing similar four-petal graphics. Those applications were either rejected or invalidated because they were considered too similar to Louis Vuitton's earlier marks.
Let me
Sure.
also make an assessment. I mean, this is actually, it might be true, it may not be true. I don't know, but I think at the end of the day, you can't make a judgment of infringement of trademark based on intent, right? I mean, you have to have real action and indeed resulting in damages. I think that's more of a comprehensive legal assessment in my view.
Right, that's a legal question. But to, the reason why Louis Vuitton decided to bring this lawsuit now, Yuxuan, do you have any idea, or are you a consumer of Louis Vuitton's product?
No, and that's way out of my pocket, unfortunately. We do not know, actually, Louis Vuitton's exact internal reasoning. It has only made a public explanation of its general position, I think, on the 27th. So the group's chief financial officer says something very vaguely about intellectual property being a core asset of this company, but nothing more.
Subu, from maybe a third country's perspective, why do you think Louis Vuitton had to or decided to bring this lawsuit at this moment?
Yeah, we with a lot of luxury brands, including LVMH brand. So we have been following this case quite closely. So I think one of the key things is I think there are multiple factors why this would have come into phase. Primarily because Molly Tea was, I would say, quite small in the beginning, right? So it's had about 120 stores, but by Feb of this year, it's got over 2,200 stores nationwide. And because they also increasingly overlap with what Louis Vuitton does, right? Louis Vuitton also has registered Chinese registrations covering cafes and restaurants. It has its own new cafes now opening up in Chengdu and Shanghai, and Molly Tea has also moved into coffee in April. So considering that and its previous application for some of these patents, trademarks have been outright rejected before. So I think Louis Vuitton did not have any choice but to actually go ahead with filing this suit because it's becoming more national, the brand. And there was also quite a bit of online suggestions about when Modity started prominently using this across its ecosystem. There were a lot of people talking about why the design looks like LV like and asking whether it was actually LV collaboration. So that also started to increase the interest of the legal side and also public opinion. And so I think the LV team did not have much choice but to actually make sure that it doesn't infringe on their established trademark.
Right. John, do you agree? It's something LV has to do. Had it decided not to sue, could that have weakened its ability to, enforce its intellectual property rights in future cases?
Well, I think it's really premised upon the assumption that the infringement has indeed occurred. For any company, I fully understand that position. If this is something definitely they should do if they are trading market the invention or ideas that being infringed upon. Of course, they're going to take actions to defend it. You can't open the floodgate. I guess that's the argument, right? I'm not disputing that. It's just that I think ultimately the substance of this case is really about whether infringement did indeed happen, right? And that's an intricate matter, actually. At least, I can't imagine from a typical and an average consumer's perspective that any connection can be established with this little tea company and LV. Again, I'm saying I'm not representing all the consumers, but for any casual, untrained eyes, I mean, if there's any, I don't remotely even think about, you see this brand, this image for the first time, for example. I mean, it's the widest imagination that a connection can be established between this image with LV. Well, maybe people who are die-hard LV people, they're intimately familiar with LV, and they probably can discern, the little bit of a connection. You see, this little, is this a flower or something, that's similar to the LV, the image, but not into LV? Maybe for those people, they have some idea about this.
Right.
But for an average person, especially a man, right? I don't have the slightest idea about that connection.
Right. They target men as well. But some people say it's partly because LV's performance in China is on decline, right? So they want to, try to find some compensation, if you will.
Yeah, well, I think it's somebody else said that, but I would say it's an absurd argument. The fact that LV sales is in decline is because of tea companies doing very well.
They want
I
to.
mean, where's that? Where does that
No,
come
no,
from?
that's not the direct compensation. It's that their performance in China is not that good. So
in
they
general,
want,
you're saying,
right.
right?
Louis Vuitton has won quite some trademark cases in China before, including some against the China National Intellectual Property Administration. But none of them attracted anything like the attention this one has. Why has this case struck such a nerve, probably to Yuxuan first?
I think it also has to do with the scale of the patent being used. So, as was mentioned, Molly Tea is not a small brand. It has more than 2,000 shops nationwide. The pattern has been used in shop fronts and merchandise, and also on the cups, on the teacups. So I think to perceiving the story as a French luxury brand suing a local domestic tea brand who's dedicated to promoting traditional culture does strike a chord with Chinese audiences.
John, your take?
Well, my reading of the news is that people are astonished, are shocked to see that, you know. I think a lot of people wake up to see what, you know, just the kind of reaction I'm describing for myself.
You know, actually, Chinese social media has been overwhelmingly supportive of Molly Tea, with countless parody videos mocking Louis Vuitton. I think people are not objecting to intellectual property protection itself. They believe Louis Vuitton is trying to monopolize a traditional Chinese decorative motif, right? That's where this whole online sensation is all about, right? I'm not sure if any of you have been following this, but
Yep.
maybe Subu, you know, from marketing perspective or consumer psychology perspective, why has that narrative resonated so strongly, according to your knowledge of the Chinese market?
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that. Right. So it's a very broad stroke of what encompasses a trademark, because the motive itself it goes decades, not decades, centuries back, right, to Song Dynasty, when it was used everywhere. I mean, I've seen videos on Show about, you know, these motifs being on toilets, and that's becoming a prominent parody video. So it's gone into a very different direction of how people are reciprocating after the win. But I think there's two different concepts here that we need to be aware of, right? So one is the legal part, which is very much required for commercial operation of entities and to be protected by that. And Chinese law is also very, very strict in that, right? So you can't go ahead and, you know, trademark a basic geometry or decorative form. And it's also very difficult to monopolize that. But then when you have a very specific way of putting it, they have very different distinctive features that they have put in their trademark to say that this belongs to Louis Vuitton, and they have been established for decades, right? So they have been in China for a long time. There is also an emotional resonance to this design that might look very similar to the old design, but also again very distinct to LV if you are a very you know, if you look at it very, very carefully, right? So the application itself, you know, needs to challenge the precise design, the evidence, and argue against why it is not right for LV to defend it. But from a public perspective, from a layman's perspective, it becomes more difficult, because you look at two different motifs, two different designs, and it looks, you know, maybe 90% similar. So you would say that it is same. While it is similar, it is not the same. Right. So, and again, when it comes to law and when it comes to distinguishing, there are different criteria where the court and the lawyers would argue that these things are different. So again, that's why it doesn't sit so well with the mass market and people, because to a normal lay person, it just looks very similar. They're saying, why are you trying to, you know, trademark something that's been used in China for centuries?
So we're not trying to explain this from a legal perspective. I know none of us are, you know, a lawyer, but from a social perspective, right? But legally, the court's decision was based on registered trademarks, but much of the online debate has focused instead on who the four-petal floral motif really belongs to. So, John, what does that kind of phenomenon or shift, if you will, in focus tell us?
Yeah, well, I think, again, I would categorize as people being shocked to hear it and just to realize that, you know, this is very difficult to comprehend because of the peculiarity of the accusation here. I understand that it's going to be a legal process, and experts are going to work out a very specific legal question as to whether infringement indeed happens or not. But just from a layman's perspective, you ask this question about similarity, right? I mean, to what extent they are similar? I have a very simple methodology to answer this question. You look at the elements that are similar to each other and ask this question: what is the percentage of this thing that is particularly similar to the other one out of the total image you are seeing? So, you can easily ask this question: this little flower pattern, what is the area of this thing out of the total area of a bag? And I would say it's probably 1%, 2% of the total bag. And ask the other question: what is the percentage of this little sign out of the total area of that cup, of the teacup? Yeah, maybe 10%, maybe 5%, right? So 1% of A is similar to 2% of B, A being the bag, B being the tea, cup of the tea. And on top of this, there's also the differences in color. So you need to apply another discount. From a very simple statistical probabilistic perspective, we're really talking about 1% times 2% times maybe another 50% this accounting for the difference in color. And then you're talking about a 0.00005 number. This is the percentage of similarity between the two products. As a trained economist or as a trained statistician, I view it from that angle. That's my answer to the question how similar they are. Right?
We're not trying to, right? We're not trying to explain why Louis Vuitton won this case or the technical issue, but the issue about why the public or the Chinese public is in support of Molly Tea, despite Louis Vuitton's win. And there is a huge row here in this country.
The methodology I described exactly answers your question. I think people are shocked and outraged by this, 0.0001% similarity between the two products. That's, I think, people are why so shocked about this. And so many people are supporting this Molly Tea.
And some commentators actually say that nationalism amplified the public reaction. Yuxuan, do you think that's a fair assessment?
Well, I will not exactly go straight and call it nationalism. I would call it a more assured sense of national identity. And I think in recent years, many people have observed this trend on the Chinese internet, that people are becoming more aware of the cultural heritage. They're starting wearing traditional Chinese costumes, using traditional handicraft. And this example is also a reflection of that trend. And the fact that I think people would say nationalism has thing to do with it is because some of the posts are so viral and aggressive that I think just reflects people's outrages instead of outright nationalism.
Indeed. Then, John, does this controversy reflect something deeper about how Chinese consumers view international brands today?
No, I agree. I think people are outraged in addition to what I just described, but also outraged by the fact that this symbol is definitely into the realm of old Chinese tradition. That's very symbolic thing in the Chinese culture. That also has a play, I would say. But I think you asked this question: if it's not this sort of very old Chinese thing, you replace with something else. Replace with something maybe, let's say, belonging to the Japanese culture, let's say, okay, make that assumption. And ask the same question: will people be as outraged at this time as they are being right now? And my answer is that it may well be, actually. I think the sort of the national sentiment is a secondary reason. The primary reason is just because of the peculiarity, and I would even argue it's the absurdity of the connection, for this. So again, I would stick to. Of course, I mean, there are people out there who are, very much driven by this sort of national sentiment. But I just don't believe that, overwhelming percentage of people because of that. Let's say, put it the other way, if let's say the copying is like almost 90% copying, let's say, and then they ask this question, are people going to be, so many people are going to be outrageous because of this? I don't think a lot of people will be outraged because, it's copy, 90% similar, even if it belongs to a sort of an old Chinese culture, blah, blah, blah. I just don't believe that a lot of people out there are still going to be outraged because of this. It's a copyright thing legitimately, even if it belongs to a old Chinese tradition, Chinese culture. And then, 90% copying is almost like 100% copying. I don't think a lot of people will be outraged because of this. So I think the very fundamental thing is still very much because, again, the peculiarity and absurdity of this connection between these two products.
All right. Subu, your take here?
Yeah, I think for me, Chinese consumers have become, more confident and more selective, right? So if you look at it from a consumer point of view, 10 years back, the prestige of a major European luxury house might have dominated the conversation, right? But today, consumers are more willing to separate the product quality from, what corporate behavior is, and to challenge the idea that international heritage, automatically gives a brand superior cultural standing. So that notion is gone. But this does not mean that Chinese consumers are rejecting international brands, right? It just means that their admiration is more conditional. So brands are being judged not just on innovation, value, and services, but also on the cultural behavior and how they use their power in the market. So taking their position as somebody who's powerful, who's big, and trying to squash all the small players would become very adversarial for the brand when in Chinese consumers' eyes. But to legitimately go and fight and keep what they feel is this and clearly communicating that across to the Chinese consumers would probably alleviate some of these problems.
You've been listening to the Chat Lounge. Then in reality, what may come next? That's right after the break. We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us.
Do you have a story about China? We want to hear from you. Maybe China has become your second home. Maybe it has brought you new friendships, creative partnerships, or a new path in life. We are inviting people from the U.S. to share their real stories and experiences with China. No expertise needed, just your authentic voice. Your story could be featured in our Hello from the Other Shore podcast coming this September. Share your name, city, and story with us. Email us at radio@cgtn.com.
The best military commander is not he who fights 100 battles and wins every one of them. The best military strategy does not lead to the desiccation of the enemy's capital city. Decoding the Art of War will help you understand why there's no art in war and how Sun Tzu stayed undefeatable using the science of war, with fun stories and insightful breakdown of famous battles. Find Decoding the Art of War wherever you listen.
Welcome back. We continue our chat on French luxury brand Louis Vuitton's trademark dispute with Chinese milk tea chain Mali Tea. Mali Tea has said it will appeal the ruling. John, I understand you've represented some clients in IP disputes before. So how do you expect the appeal to unfold?
Well, just a little bit of a correction. I'm not a lawyer. I don't represent.
I understand that.
Yeah, I do testimony in court because of economics matters, and I've been involved in a lot of patent disputes or standard essential patents disputes. Providing expert testimonies related to patent matters. But this is a trademark case, so it's a bit different. But again, I think it has to boil down to some objective assessment of question is how similar these things are, right? And I think that's still very much fundamental to the validity of this case. Now, the first instance ruling has already come out, and the Maliti has appealed to a higher court. According to China's law, the second trial will be the final trial, right? The final verdict. And what I'm concerned is actually, definitely there's going to be public pressure because so many people are so much outraged because of this, right? The second thing I want to say is that the compensation is also related to the extent of damage to the plaintiff, and on that matter, I think I'm qualified to say a few things. I'm really puzzled as to how the success of this tea company can somehow slow down sales or impair sales at the LV side. That's a very, very difficult question to answer, right? We need to have some empirical evidence to establish the causal relationship as a result of this tea company adopting this trademark sign.
LV could one day extend its business to drinks or beverages, and they want to use this, right?
No. This is not a valid point. I mean, you can't, based on damage compensation, based on the idea that this infringes or somehow damages the prospect of future sales, right? That in Chinese court, that doesn't hold at all. You have to be establishing a case that up until now, by adopting this sign by the tea company, somehow empirically there is evidence to show that the sales of LV bags or LV other products are being impaired. And how do you prove that? I mean, let alone getting data and establishing a causal relationship and the different kinds of causality here. And we're talking about a very strict legal causality concept. It's almost like you walk out of a grocery store and sip over a banana, right? And you fell down, and this is a causal relationship. Because of the banana in front of the grocery store, you fell down and you got damaged, right? This kind of a causality. In other words, because of adopting the sign at the tea company, your sales are being adversely affected.
Right, but you should ask this question to the judge of the Suzhou Intermediary Court. And the result is, or the outcome is, actually Maliti lost that case, right?
Yeah, right.
And similar disputes involving Louis Vuitton's floral motifs have been actually heard in European Union, Japan, Singapore, and even France, where Louis Vuitton is headquartered. And in almost all those cases, Louis Vuitton ultimately lost. So there comes another question. Why was it able to prevail in China, Zhang?
That I don't know, actually. I'm not in the court proceeding. I wasn't there. But I'm also very curious, actually. How can they lose this case? Having gone through, numerous cases in the IP domain. And, I thought this is actually should be quite easy to establish. Maybe they should hire some expert, I guess, to establish, first of all, the tenuous connection between these two things. Second, the even more tenuous connection because of the causality of, assumed infringement on the sales of the other side. Do they have any empirical evidence? Did they do any empirical analysis? Even without doing an empirical analysis, just from a very intuitive perspective, I mean, the first question I want to ask is, what is the cross-demand elasticity between these two products? This is actually an economics term, right? Product A and product B. Because of more attractiveness of product A, causing the sales decline of product B. So there is some kind of a demand elasticity across these two products. So the economics term would be called cross-elasticity of demand between these two products. What are these two products? One is a bag, one is a tea. What is the cross-elasticity between these two products? The demand for these two products? Intuitively, I would say zero. I mean, you ask this question, if the tea tastes much better, looks much nicer, are you more incentivized to go out, buy less of a bag? That's such an easy question to answer.
Well, I think Google has some answer to the question why LV lost similar lawsuits in those countries or regions. It's because that basic geometric, quadrille lobed or floral shapes are common in the marketplace. And the judges emphasize that basic shapes cannot be overly monopolized as exclusive property unless clear, distinct imitation or consumer deception across specific product categories is proven. I think it's more or less related to your argument, but what we have now is that Louis Vuitton has won this case in China, right? And no matter what compensation it can get, there is this question: is it going to pay bigger price? Even if Louis Vuitton ultimately wins the legal battle, some people argue Louis Vuitton may already have lost public goodwill because we've seen calls for, boycotts on social media. And some secondhand luxury retailers say LV products that once sold quickly have become harder to move. Then maybe this question goes to Yuxuan first. Have you noticed any reaction like this? And how much of a commercial impact could this controversy actually have?
Well, I think the immediate commercial damage is difficult to gauge. We've seen, of course, reports that second-hand dealers saying that it's been harder to sell Louis Vuitton bags, but some also say it's a seasonal change. But from what I observe, there is a visible reputational damage to the brand. And I think long-term speaking, that's the most detrimental part to the brand image, because a luxury brand sells more than a bag. It sells aspiration, taste, and some kind of symbolic authority. If younger Chinese consumers begin to regard Louis Vuitton as a culturally arrogant, over-aggressive, or disconnected from Chinese society, the company may gradually lose part of the symbolic value that allows it to charge luxury prices. And that kind of reputational damage is more difficult to measure, and we will have to wait and see.
Then what would you say could be the highest cost for Louis Vuitton? The damage of its brand image or any longer lasting consequence?
Well, there are precedents for this in the Chinese market. If a luxury brand is, I don't want to name names, but if luxury brand is regarded as culturally arrogant, the end result could be a drastic fall in sales or closure of shops in China. A commercial impact could be long lasting.
Subu, from your perspective, could this prove to be another, short-lived social media storm, or do you see any long-lasting impact?
Yeah, I agree with what Yuxuan was saying. The largest cost could be loss of the cultural goodwill and the benefit of doubt for a big brand rather than just immediate sales, right? So luxury brands like Louis Vuitton sell more than just materials and craftsmanship. They sell the symbolism, the aspiration, and the social meaning of owning a Louis Vuitton bag. So if LV begins to represent cultural arrogance or disproportionate corporate power, especially to the younger generation, younger consumers, it's going to become harder to generate organic advocacy, defend further price increases, or make that exclusivity and build credible cultural collaboration. And temporary issues like this and social media hashtags is manageable. You can either be quiet about it or try to engage in conversation to point out your story. But losing the cultural permission to command a premium is going to be far more expensive, and over the long run it might get more difficult for them to climb back up if this animosity continues further.
And John, from a business perspective, if Louis Vuitton continues to take an aggressive approach to, trademark enforcement, particularly over designs that many Chinese consumers regard as a part of their traditional cultural heritage, what does that mean, for the brand's future in China?
Well, there are three issues here in my view. One, of course, is we've extensively discussed. That is the validity of the infringement, right? In my view, the causes it's valid, but I think it's kind of a tenuous argument here, and the public opinion probably most likely agrees with me. The second issue is a classic case of winning the battle, losing the war here. In other words, people are outraged because of this tenuous connection, because of the absurdity of the connection here. And even if the first instance delivers a win for the company, for LV, the public's outraged. Some of them are gonna boycott buying LV bags or other accessory products. And some people are still going to buy, I guess. And from that perspective, you can make the case that the company has won the battle, even assuming they're going to keep winning in the second trial. They have lost the war. People are outraged by this, right? The third matter, I have a little problem with the third issue here. The third issue seems to be suggesting that LV is basically, well, at least according to some experts, LV is saying that it's running out of things to trademark, and because the argument is that it's so easily can be challenged, and to the extent that it has potential damage to its reputation, to its ability to trademark these things, to come up with interesting designs, blah, 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 that kind of argument. And from that perspective, it actually damages the company. I have a huge problem with this argument. I mean, this is basically saying that LV is running out of things to trademark. And to the extent that in the future, it's going to limit the company's creativity and then, the brand reputation and value. Come on, who are you, LV? Why are you so certain that you should be able to monopolize all these geometric signs? I mean, this is such an arrogant argument. It's unbelievably arrogant argument. And I think, if the company takes that position, it's going to keep challenged, and it's going to keep winning. Even if it's winning these battles, it's going to keep losing the war. If the company takes that position, I don't have any sympathy for this company at all. The company's sales not doing well, so be it. It's all their own asking for it, in my view, if that's the case. That's all I have to say about this thing.
Right, I think Yuxuan just mentioned it could be some seasonal slowdown in the sales, right? But some argue or some see this could be a turning point for the brand in China. John, do you also see it that way, or do you think it's just overstated, this impact?
Well, my gut feeling is that these things are being overstated. I think there might be a general trend, there's a broader trend here that the Western or the French luxury brands are not as dominant in the Chinese market as they used to be. I think the younger generation are more open. Sometimes people go out and buy other higher priced products of the national brands. But the automobile market is a perfect example, right? I think you're regularly seeing, more and more Chinese brands automobiles, NIO, for example, priced in the 400,000, 500,000 price range, yuan price range. And I think the brand image, not the brand value or the product's value, say Audi and Mercedes-Benz, are crushing now in China. You can go out and buy an Audi brand car, less than 150,000 yuan, a little bit over $20,000 for a brand new Audi branded car in China these days. Think about it, right? And I just can't imagine why the same thing cannot happen in the accessory market, in the bag market. This could similarly happen as well. I think that it's quite possible in the future.
Right, Subu.
Yeah, I think if you ask me if it's a turning point for LV, I would say
Mm.
it's not reached that point yet. One single controversy is really going to change the trajectory of a brand, especially one as established as Louis Vuitton. The backlash would need to persist. It needs to be affect no influential creators or clients and become attached to further disputes. Then maybe the product desirability will go down and it become truly a commercial turning point for them. LB already has an opportunity to contain this issue, right? It can clarify that it is protecting a precise commercial, identifier, which is a trademark, rather than claiming ownership of generic, geometric, or a faux pattern imagery. But also at the same time, they should acknowledge the wider cultural sensitivity and probably have a more engaging conversation with the general Chinese public. And it becomes a turning point if we treat the first instance statement as, it's just sufficient proof that it has nothing else to address and becomes like what John was mentioning, becomes a bit arrogant, then I think there's potentially more problem. A court victory can settle a legal claim, but it does not settle what the brand now represents to the public. All right, so the public opinion is different from a legal opinion.
This has been the Chat Lounge. Louis Vuitton isn't the first international brand to spark controversy in China. After the break, we'll look beyond this case and explore what it means for global brands operating in the Chinese market. Don't go away.
He can't live without the Yellow River in his eyes.
The Yellow River is so noble and elegant.
Both my grandpa and dad made a living from the river.
Would you like to move away from the Yellow River?
I don't think I will. I love it so much.
The Yellow River, the second longest river in China, is regarded as a shaping force in the history, economy and culture of northern China. Today, about 100 million people live within its water basin, making up nearly 9% of the country's population. How is climate change felt at its headwaters, and what are the locals doing to cope with it? What are the descendants of the boatmen doing? What has kept some people from leaving their home village by the river, and what has drawn others back? Could the fading fishing community revive in a time of digital transformation? From 2021 to 2024, our reporters visited the upper, middle and lower reaches of the Yellow River, talked to the herders, farmers, boatmen, fishermen and eco-activists who share a close bond with the river, and present their stories in pictures, podcasts and videos, all in our 12-part series, The Yellow River Mosaic, available only on CGTN Radio.
Welcome back to the chat. Then let's discuss something beyond this case. Yuxuan and Subu already mentioned about, probably you can call it arrogance with those some international brands. Actually, we've seen several international brands run into public backlash in China in recent years, over cultural controversies or advertising campaigns or public relations missteps. Then, Yuxuan, why do you think those brands keep making similar mistakes? Does it only reflect arrogance toward the Chinese market, or it's simply because they lack understanding of this market?
Well, it's probably more because they lack understanding, because
All right.
one reason is, of course, organizational distance. A decision can be made remotely in headquarters and not necessarily adequately localized. And sometimes global brand teams focus too much on consistency. Commercial teams will focus on sales. Legal teams focus on protecting rights, but they do not always have enough authority to influence the original decision. And sometimes it's another reason is just companies do not prepare for the social media narratives after legal disputes. And by the time the senior management responds, the dominant narrative may already be fixed.
Right. John, do you agree it's just a lack of understanding?
Um, I I agree. I agree. I think this the headquarters in Paris is right. But they have a team here in China, I guess. The top management here in China. But I'm not sure what other
But
decisions
they've been
being
here
made.
for
Where
decades.
well, I mean, it can be the case that major decisions are still made in Paris, and the local management does not have much of a say in this. Yeah, honestly, I think from a strategic management perspective, from a company's overall strategy perspective, I find it very hard to believe that the company takes such a position. I mean, they clearly, even from the first try instance, it's a case of losing the war, right? I mean, even if you're winning the legal battle in the court, but potentially can affect their sales, even though probably that effect may be short-term. Nevertheless, it's I mean, at least at this point, you look at public opinion, it's not much in favor of the company, right? So clearly, it's not a winning strategy in my view, right? It's winning strategy for the company lawyer, but not so much a winning strategy for the company as a whole.
That if you're saying that's because of a lack of understanding, what would you say could be the biggest lesson, for international brands, or they can take away from this case, against the backdrop of a slowing growth in the global luxury market and increasingly rational, value conscious Chinese consumers?
Yeah, well, I think the public opinion, the public relations management is particularly important for luxurious brand because their entire business case is built on reputation. It's built on perception, public perception, right? Why do you go out buy an LV bag? Is it because it's more useful? No, it's not because it's more useful. Because if the people think that elevates your status, that's the idea, right? That's the whole idea. But if the public applauds your brand, this whole argument just collapsed. There's no reason for buying LV bag anymore, right? Why would you buy something and carry it out and walk on the streets with something that is being applauded by the public, right? There's no case for that. So I think from a luxurious brand perspective, these matters are particularly important. You have to be very sensitive in public opinion. This is not like going out and buy a cutting edge, 5G chip, right? Or AI chip. It's totally different. It's storytelling, basically. People are buying the story, basically. And, it's very vulnerable, in my view, if you're not being careful.
Right. And Subu, do you think, those big international brands, they have any urgency to change or to maybe improve their operation here in the Chinese market?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as John mentioned, I think it's just a starting point, right? The strong legal right is just a starting point. But I think Chinese consumers are also accessing whether the product justifies its price, whether the brand is still innovating, whether it conducts in proportionately to the status it enjoys. So while heritage remains valuable, but it's no longer removes the need to prove that relevance is important, contemporary relevance is important. Before taking any major public action, I think the brand should understand how the visual will look outside of legal department. All right, again, it cannot be very siloed discussions. Is the right clear to an ordinary consumer? Just because you have legal authority over your trademark, does it sit well with ordinary consumers? Is the remedy proportionate? Can the company explain its position without appearing dismissive of Chinese history or public sentiment. All this would matter, and in a fast-growing market, maybe you can skip some of them because some reputational mistake can be absorbed by expanding demand. But in selective, slower market and especially in value-conscious luxury markets, consumer concentrate spending among fewer brands, and a small shift in desirability becomes quite commercially significant for these brands.
And then, Yuxuan, what kind of advice would you provide, for those international or big brands, especially from a younger generation's perspective? After all, you are the generation that could decide whether those international brands can be or can continue to be successful in China in the future.
Yes, because as we see with Louis Vuitton and other luxury brands, their previous localization campaigns have been focused on using Chinese celebrities, celebrating Chinese festivals, or simply adding traditional Chinese visual elements to an advertising campaign. But from now on, I think it is time that they realized real localization also means understanding how Chinese consumers interpret questions of history, cultural ownership, and it's about time they paid enough attention to the question of power and fairness.
Right. And the last question, maybe a little bit loosely related to this, but some actually see this kind of cases or disputes as an opportunity for Chinese homegrown brands to strengthen their competitiveness. So, John, what are the chances?
I think there's an overall trend happening already. I think, from a design perspective, from business perspective, there are quite a few indigenous companies that have made great strides in their market participation. They may be quite successful. So I think this is the greater context here. And for foreign companies, especially luxury brands operating here in China, they should be cognizant of the changing environment here. And, the strategy should be taken into consideration of this broader trend. And this is an irreversible trend in my view. And you would expect that in an economy that's keep developing, living standards keep rising, the younger generation consumers are getting more and more sophisticated. And I also agree that a certain degree of national sentiment among these young generation, next generation consumers as well.
Right. Hopefully your advices can be heeded by those big brands. And on that note, we wrap up our chat for this session. Many thanks to Gong at the University of International Business and Economics, Jia Yuxuan from the Center for China and Globalization, and Subramania Bhatt with China Trading Desk. Please tell us what you think of the topic and the show. Drop us a line at radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tuyun. Thank you for being with us. Join us again for more chat at the Chat Lounge next week. Till then, take care.
As you sip your morning coffee, we transport you from the sea of tulips in the countryside to the exciting moments of table tennis worlds.
France 3-0 to win the men's team title at table tennis.
As you commute in the hustle and bustle of rush hour traffic, we guide you to navigate from intricacies of global markets,
International Monetary Fund has
tech revolutions, to the El Nino triggered fires.
Says over 90 active fires.
As you gather around a community event, we provide you the vibrant sounds on different topics, such as how AI empowers education,
that provide teachers and students.
What does Lung or the Chinese dragon mean to the Chinese people?
Symbolizing great power, good luck, and strength.
Why live stream shopping is gaining popularity in Brazil.
Entrepreneurs are seeking to establish a strong presence in the Brazilian market.
CGTN Radio, your constant companion to connect people through sharing insights, interviews, and opinions that help us to see the world. Together with CGTN Radio, hear the difference. You can download the CGTN app to get more valued information